everybody, and welcome to this week's Tech Opinions podcast. I'm Bob O'Donnell, the founder and chief analyst at Technalysis Research, and joined this week by Ben Beheron, the editor-in-chief at Tech Opinions, and our special guest, who we have every year, at least once and sometimes twice, our good buddy Steve Baker from NPD. How are you guys?
Good. I'm great. Couldn't be better. Happy to be locked up in my house. For somebody who used to travel 45 weeks a year, kind of like you guys may have, this has been, having only been more than 20 miles away from my house once in the last year has been a very interesting activity.
Indeed it has. Indeed it has. And of course, what's interesting as the light is starting to appear at the end of the tunnel, everybody's starting to think about what it's going to be like and what are we going to do again? Are you ever going to really travel 45 weeks a year again? My guess is probably not, right? You're probably rethinking that, as is, I think, everybody.
Yeah,
definitely going to be interesting to see what happens and a lot of implications. But what's great to add, so for those of you who've been listening to the podcast for a long time, we always tend to have Steve on kind of post-holiday because NPD, for those of you who don't know, tracks retail sales of all kinds of stuff. And Steve is the main, looks at all the big tech categories, everything from PC, smartphones, game consoles, all that good stuff. So he always has tremendous real world insight because this is what people are actually buying. And so this year we didn't do a holiday thing, but of course the whole world has been very different this year. And so we thought it'd be great to have Steve on to talk a little bit about holiday, a little bit about 2020, a little bit about the beginning of the year, and most importantly, hey, we're literally almost exactly a year post-pandemic. So now it's that year-over-year comparison because, after the initial fears of the pandemic being horrendous, turned out to be amazing for the electronics sales. So I guess at a high level, Steve, just kind of where are we and what can you give us as an overview?
Sure. So 2020 for the whole year in NPD's data was saw about a 17% year-over-year revenue increase. I've been doing this a long time. We probably would have to go back to the turn of the millennium to get to numbers like 17% increases, right? This is a great big high installed base business. Prior to the pandemic in 17, 18, 19, we were growing 2, 3, 4%. So 17% is a huge number. The components of that, last year in Q2 and Q3, we were up about 25%. And for the holiday, we were only up about 15%. Q4, we started to see maybe some of the growth in products start to slow a little bit. Obviously, we started to see challenges with inventory and logistics. We started to see the first shoots of what we're seeing now in terms of cost increases and some of those things being passed on. So the holiday season was a little mixed up until the end of the holiday season, because at the end of December, we got another stimulus payment. And what we have seen over the last year is when money goes out to people, a lot of them spend it. And because of the essential nature of technology in the last year, for us to do Zoom calls from working at home, streaming, all those kind of things, people have tended to put more money towards electronics. So actually, since the first of the year, and NPD has 9 weeks of Q1 data, our revenue is actually up 28%. So it's very similar to what we saw in Q2, Q3 last year. And those numbers have remained really, really strong. A little bit of a dip here and there, and certainly we'll talk about some categories. It's not the same for every single segment going forward, but our forecast for Q1 revenue growth was only 13%. So I think we're gonna blow that away.
Wow. So, I mean, and, as we were talking right before we started, what's really going to be interesting is, as I briefly mentioned, we're at that year-over-year comparison point for the beginning of the pandemic. Any sense of what we're going to see year over year? And as we move into Q2, have you guys done a Q2
Yeah.
forecast?
So we have forecasts all the way out to 2023. Here's what we've been telling people, and we've actually been telling people this since August, which is do not believe that you have to comp 2020, right? 2020 was a historic year. And the example I always give is NPD tracked almost 50 million TV sales in 2020. We are never going to see 50 million units of television sold again. And if your management or somebody says to you, you have to grow that by 20% again, it's just not going to happen. So we're really, really focused on what we call 2Y over Y. So not just looking at 2020, because you still want to understand that, but looking back at 2019 and saying, so what is the long-term trend in the market? Are we still above the trends that we saw pre-pandemic? Because those would all go to justify what I said earlier about, people buying technology because of necessities and all those changes in habits that we've all started to track. So our Q2, actually the whole Q2 to Q4, the rest of 2021 is our forecast is for mid-teens revenue growth over 2019 and low to mid single digit declines versus 2020. So we're still forecasting a very, very robust 2021 for technology. And in fact, the way we look at it, when you go even through the beginning parts of 2022, we still see some positive momentum. We think there will be what I'm calling a donut hole from kind of Q1 2022 to holiday 2023 as we start to get into much tougher comps, and we've already maybe gone through a lot of the updates and upgrades that we really have seen. By the time we get to holiday 2023, we'll actually be at a point where if we had just been growing by 2% all the time, we'll be at that number by holiday 2023. And then we expect going forward, we'll see what kind of growth rates we're going to see then.
Interesting.
So one of the things that stands out to me, and I think the way that you're talking about, right, not using last year as a comp is interesting. The thing though that I think standing back and observing last year that's of interest is, you could argue that not just did we sell, a good amount of devices, whether that was, PCs is a good category. More people got them than had them before. You could argue, as sure you guys saw with TVs or monitors penetrated more rooms than they were in before. And so I look at that as that big growth that you saw in terms of not just volume and revenue as potential installed base growth, which would suggest that while we're not going to see, that volume again, we could see a more steady cycle over the 2, 3, 4 year time frame, assuming that people refresh devices that they got into. And this, I think this spans every category, right? If you all of a sudden got more smart home gear, well, at some point in time, it's reasonable to assume you'll upgrade that. So the more people that buy more of this stuff broadens the whole market for consumer electronics. And so that's hard to forecast, but I think that's a positive for the industry that you did see so much spending that could lead to a little bit more of a steady revenue number, less, ebbs and flows perhaps as we saw before for the next few years.
And I think that's why when we look out into that donut hole and out to the end of 2023, that's when we start to see the impact of changes in the way people are using and owning and install bases starting to pick up back again. Because clearly we're going to get to a point where most everybody has updated the things they're going to update, and we go back to more of a standard measure of updates. So we're going to have some kind of a little bit of a hole. And we're not forecasting 20% declines in those periods. We're forecasting back to
Right.
a flat
Right.
to low single digit negatives, because these are big, to your install base points. We're talking about in PCs and televisions categories with 200 million units installed out there. So even if you replace 10 or 15 million of them over and above what you would have done with the other 25 or 30 or whatever million units you're talking about, you still have a relatively big opportunity.
Right.
The other
Right.
thing I will tell you we have seen, and I don't have the numbers for PCs, but I have them for televisions, is people, you might think that everybody is updating really old televisions and getting rid of those. And certainly we're seeing some of that. But the biggest space of upgrades is not real old televisions, but 3, 4, 5-year-old televisions that maybe don't have an operating system, or maybe don't have good Wi-Fi, or maybe are smaller. And we have seen, and you guys will appreciate this, in TVs, the average age of the installed base of televisions in the US was about 5.5 years. And that had been the same for about 5 years, right? A really big market. It's very hard to change the average age of the installed base. In 1 year, the average age of the installed base of televisions went down by half a year to under 5 years. So you could just see that not only was it just getting rid of older televisions, but a whole sea change in the way people thought about their TV when they were ready to upgrade it, and people saying, I need something that is more appropriate for the current levels of technology.
Well,
Yeah, and I guess the broad question that we don't have answer to, but I think as we keep talking to you annually, is did the revenue pie potentially grow, right? Is the opportunity of consumer electronics now larger given what we've seen? And so you'll see, again, a new base number, I guess, right, going forward in CE.
I totally believe that, and our forecasts are clearly going to be predicated on that.
Yeah, I mean, so for example, on the TV side, if they replaced that 3-year-old TV, but moved it from the living room to the bedroom, and then put the big new fancy TV in the living room, then again, to Ben's point, that's that installed base that's increasing, because that means at some point that bedroom TV gets updated as well as the living room TV, for example. I'm sure that's probably the case. Looking at PCs, it's got to be the same thing, right? A huge number of people, it wasn't about, we went from one PC per household to it's got to be one PC per person, clearly. In the pandemic world. So that clearly has got to build up that installed base. And so the hope is that, a couple of years from now, there'll be another kind of massive upgrade, because all of a sudden there's so many more people who have those devices, PCs in particular, I think.
Yep. A bunch of categories, and obviously stuff around that. Ben mentioned monitors. Monitors are probably the number one category that's been impacted by the pandemic in the consumer markets. Q2, Q3, Q4, we saw about 80% revenue growth in monitors every single quarter, basically almost every single week. It is and remains just an amazing kind of activity in terms of this growth in monitors. And the interesting part of that is, certainly we know, like, people going from one monitor to two, or working from home and sliding your notebook under the monitor and buying a new monitor. You might think that had a big impact on corporate monitor sales. And it did a little bit at the early part. But as we get into Q3 and Q4, we actually saw kind of flat sales in corporate monitors as well, or in a tiny bit of growth. So it's interesting, right? So we're seeing not people spend their own money on their own personal goods, and we're also still seeing that kind of growth in
Yeah.
the business channels as well.
What's intriguing to me though about like kind of what you said, and I think everybody anecdotally has heard, right, friends and family going, oh, I'm buying a monitor or I'm buying accessories. So no doubt, right, that category saw growth. But what's interesting is if we maintain some level of a remote work, hybrid work going forward, the purchasing channel, even if they're given money, is going to be a retail channel, right? The way in which people get work gear now in a remote environment is not just through their employer, through CDW, it's through Best Buy, it's through Dixon's, and that I think is an interesting implication that work now brings to the consumer retail channel at a dynamic that they didn't have before. That again, I think is optimism for, again, probably maybe not a notebook, but a monitor, a mouse, a keyboard, other accessories, obviously cameras, etc., headsets.
And we've already seen all those things happen. Not only is it just buying, but if you think about it from the seller's perspective and the brand, when you buy stuff for your own personal use versus the company either giving you money or buying something for you to use, guess you almost always spend more money. When it's your own monitor, you buy a bigger monitor. When it's your own mouse and keyboard, you spend more money on the mouse and keyboard. Excuse me. So there's also an average selling price benefit in here where we're seeing selling prices go up, in part because when consumers are given that money and when they go out, they are not just getting the cheapest thing that the company would have bought them. They're buying a bigger monitor and spending more money on it.
So Steve, I'd love to get some color on categories, right? Can you give us a sense of, some of the biggest categories? Obviously the big ones, you talked a little about TVs, be interesting to hear about PCs, maybe gaming consoles, but then what other things are really, really growing, and maybe what are the most surprising ones?
Sure. Well, let's start with game consoles because you can get that one done pretty easily. Every single game console that gets shipped this year will get sold. So however much we sell, that's how much the business will be, and how much will get shipped in. And nobody really knows what that kind of number is. We did see growth in consoles on a revenue basis last year, but it was relatively small, because the new stuff didn't come in until the very end of the year, and Sony and Microsoft were already planning for that. So the inventories weren't particularly robust in the middle of the year, and we sold out of a lot of those products relatively quickly. So it's interesting. They probably are now able to come into the new console environment with a little bit more clean inventory. And that brings us obviously to gaming in general. Every single category that exceeded expectations had some kind of a gaming tack to it. Monitors, I think monitors, about 35% of all monitors we identified as gaming focused monitors. We see 20 to 30% of all mice and keyboards, even higher in headsets, being gaming specific. And on the PC side, on Windows, we are seeing 40 and 50% increases at the beginning of this year in gaming, pre-configured gaming desktops, pre-configured gaming notebooks. Those products have been the fastest growing segment in the entire Windows PC environment. We've really, really seen enormous increases in those. And that's been, again, the real underpinning of a lot of those things. Because, and I think we probably have talked about this in the past, the other piece of this is the DIY market, which has exploded. Aftermarket processors, aftermarket cases, aftermarket DRAM, motherboards, power, all of them were up 50, 60% or more during 2020. And those numbers have continued into 2021. And they probably, in our data, add another, probably double the volume of gaming desktops, if you assume a good chunk of those are new build desktops out there. So there's a lot, again, going back to what we said earlier, right, about changing habits and different kinds of install bases. Gaming is creating a huge infrastructure that's going to be updated over and over again and continues to be something that more and more consumers are doing. We tracked in our gaming tracking the number of people playing PC games, and I think the survey was in mid 2020, was up 7 points from 2 years earlier, and it was the fastest growing platform that people were playing on over the prior survey. So that's a really great opportunity for everybody. Higher average selling prices, more interesting demographics, really, really an exciting opportunity for the entire supply chain.
And GPUs, you can't even get them now, right? I mean, GPUs seem to be as bad as game consoles. Like everyone that gets shipped gets purchased, it seems.
Yeah, it's CPUs too. Certainly the Ryzen 5 products are having problems as well. But so far, at least, there's enough products out there to keep those businesses positive for sure. Which brings me to something that I do want to say, because we've been talking around some of the growth numbers and some of those kind of things, and I'm sure you guys get a lot of questions about supply chain and how much inventory and logistics, and we continue to tell people that we do not have a supply problem. And even in some of these categories, we really don't have a supply problem. We have a demand problem. We have demand that is not, A, is not sustainable, but B, is not satiable in the current environment, right? This is demand that we haven't seen before. There is no way that we could satisfy all of this demand given the infrastructure that was available. So when you look at GPUs, when you look at all the shortages we've heard about in Chrome and even in monitors and other areas, that is a core challenge that we're seeing, which is how do we take care of all this demand? And one of the ways everybody's taking care of all that demand is pricing. One of the ways to tamp down demand is to raise prices. And we are seeing almost across the board average selling prices go up for three reasons, right? One is cost. Two, we have seen a decline in the level of promotion. You don't really have to promote a lot of products when there's so much demand that you can't even satisfy it. So we're seeing retailers and brands cut back on their promotions or concentrate them on higher end products that have lower volumes, that they want to encourage sales of more premium price points. And then the final part is, if you've only got 3 widgets to put in your PC, you're not going to put it in the PC that sells for $249. You're going to put it in the $799 PC, the $1299 PC. So a lot of the shortages and challenges have tended to be concentrated in lower price points and more entry level. And when there's demand and people really need stuff, what do? They're going to buy what's available. And most of the time, the retailers and the brands, what are they making available? They're making available not necessarily, the most premium only, but certainly encouraging people to trade up into higher price points.
Yeah, I think the category stuff we talk about is interesting. I mean, the gaming one's one I've been tracking pretty closely just because a couple of projects that I'm doing, but it's almost like the inability to acquire parts only fuels the demand and interest in this segment. It's like kind of FOMO, but it's one of those things where if you can't get it, you kind of want it more, and it's attracting more people than before. But the part of this that to me is actually one of the most interesting is because we've done some surveys on this, and I think it's become relatively consistent that what happened was for a lot of people, and I'll, not to be completely like gender specific, but gaming does skew more male than female as a pure volume number. But a lot of people, and both genders included, were finding that they couldn't spend time together, and so they spent time together gaming, whether that was Minecraft or multiplayer. So it became, I can't get together with my friends, but we can game together, which only fueled the market for competitiveness, for better components. You wanted a better experience. And so all of those things came back as, and that to me, though, I don't think goes away. Like, even when people can still hang out, I think a lot of people have discovered multiplayer gaming in a way that perhaps they didn't before, and this is true of PCs and consoles, etc. Um, but I mean, a lot of people that we've talked to, this has sort of replaced the I'm going to my friend's house to hang out. We're going to get online and play games, and that's been an interesting dynamic that I think has been underappreciated as a social part.
Yeah.
Not just people sitting there, not being antisocial.
Yeah, I think the social aspect is interesting. One of the nice parts about working in a bigger company where we have a diversity of people is I get to interact with people who have younger children and people maybe in their 20s who play a lot of games. I don't, I'm older. I don't have grandchildren. I don't have those kind of things yet. But I've heard a lot in an incredible amount about the social aspects of gaming, especially from people with parents of who are parents of younger kids in the 10 to 15 kind of age, and then we're all familiar with the 20 somethings who see that as part of that as well. So 100% agree with you, and that just goes all the way back to all the installed base and all the other stuff you were talking about earlier, Ben. The best, there's a lot of horrible things, obviously, about what's going on in the last year. We certainly don't want to minimize any of that. But the best part for the long-term health of this business has been, again, this jumping away from just technology as just kind of basic tools to being a much more ingrained part of people's lives from 10 to 88. I get my 88-year-old dad on Zoom calls now, and he's okay with that. He can figure it out. He wants to do it. He wants to see his kids. So we've got a much wider range of consumers who believe in the power and the value of the products that we're selling.
Yeah, for sure.
That's
And I think a lot of these moments are becoming those sort of inflection points because whether it's gaming, whether it's video conferencing, whether it's home security, etc., there's always that barrier to adoption being, especially when it's new, I don't know if I'm going to like it. Once you do it, and you're sold, you become a regular user or consumer participant in that ecosystem. And that's where I think, again, arguably, and I think you said this at the beginning, and I think this is an interesting, overarching narrative, is just how essential tech has been, but tech as a whole was relatively still underpenetrated, right? Every human on the planet didn't have every bit of technology available to them, not even every person in developed markets, right, like the US. And so now all of a sudden you see an increase in the number of technology that they're exposed to, either purchased for their home or for themselves, etc. And I mean, again, I think a lot of that sticks. Like, it's not like you're just all of a sudden going to stop using Zoom when you want to talk to your family who lives on the other side of the world or East Coast. It was just you didn't do it before because you hadn't really experienced it. You didn't know what Zoom was. You didn't have a camera. Now you have all these things. So it feels like there's regular behaviors that technology has embedded themselves into that now just increases that exposure and those use cases, and then arguably innovation in all of those areas going forward, from everything, hardware, software. Because one of the things you said about TVs that I think is really interesting is I've been wrestling if the shift to streaming platforms only increases some of the demand for TV features that weren't there before, right? Linear cable was not that innovative. It was like, I give you a box, this is basic channels, but now you've got Dolby, HDR, you have content producers trying to create different experiences. And so I wonder if the move away from bundled cable towards streaming services creates an interesting new dynamic around TVs that we didn't see before, where some features of technology can be trickle down drivers that perhaps, to your point, increase the refresh rates, maybe not longer than 5 years or too much shorter, but definitely slightly shorter where they were, because you want those new features more regularly to go along with the content your streaming service is trying to innovate around.
Well, certainly TVs, the growth in gaming, a lot of the high-end TVs are incorporating, the HDMI 2.1 and other features to help, make high-end and premium gaming work a lot better. The other piece of that is not just the screen and the things like how the software gets there, but the components, things like if you're going to stream, how good is your Wi-Fi connection, right? Or what are those kind of things? We didn't mention it, but from a large category perspective, probably the second biggest category that had growth was routers, right?
Yeah.
And honestly, we probably don't even track. We maybe track a third of all the router sales because so many people get them from their cable, from their ISPs. And we saw that category went up like 50%. We've seen a faster uptake on Wi-Fi 6 than we've ever seen on any other platform as people start to think about how important that is. I'm fond of telling clients that before the pandemic, people internally at NPD would always send me emails asking what TV they should buy. Now they send me emails asking what router they should buy, right? So we've kind of changed people's mindsets. The infrastructure things are more important. So I suspect over the next year or two, people are going to be thinking about, what kind of Wi-Fi connections can I get on my television? What kind of HDMI connections are there for gaming or for more premium services like a VR? So we're creating that demand long-term for better quality products, which again is only a benefit in terms of revenue and profits and the ability to do more R&D going forward and continue the cycle. Innovation, NPD tracks a lot of categories, right? We track tech and gaming, but we track appliances, but we track soft goods like clothing and shoes and apparel. And a lot of those have not done very well. And one of the reasons technology has been one of the real stars is the innovation that technology always brings and continues to bring to the consumer.
Well, that is a perfect way to end. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Ben, because we are running on time here. But
good chat.
Great chat, man. Yeah, that was so interesting as always. It's a true pleasure to have you on, Steve, and Ben. Thanks for helping organize, and thanks to all of you, of course, for tuning in. We do greatly appreciate it, and we'll look forward to speaking with all of you again soon. Thanks so much. Take care.